Have you ever noticed how the most life-changing advice rarely shouts for attention? It doesn't barge into the room with flashy slogans or demand your obedience. Instead, it whispers sometimes so quietly you almost miss it. Think back to a moment when clarity struck you, maybe during a walk or in the stillness of early morning, when the noise of the world faded away. That's when wisdom tends to speak. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor who ruled one of history's greatest empires, understood this deeply. He wrote his profound insights not for an audience, but for himself in the quiet hours of reflection. And yet, centuries later, those private words still guide millions. Why? Because the loudest voices in the room are often the ones least worth hearing, while the truth, the real truth, emerges in silence. There's a reason for this. Our egos love noise. They thrive on certainty, on being right, on the illusion that we already have the answers. But Stoicism teaches us something radical. The louder our ego shouts, the harder it becomes to hear what actually matters. The ego distorts, exaggerates, and filters every piece of advice through its own agenda. It turns wisdom into a weapon, something to defend our pride with, rather than a tool for growth. That's why the most powerful lessons often come disguised as ordinary moments. A passing comment from a stranger, a line in a book that seems to jump off the page, or even a failure that humbles us into listening. These aren't accidents, they're invitations to quiet the noise, to disarm the ego, and finally hear what we've been missing. So how do we tune into that quieter, wiser voice? It starts by recognizing that the ego isn't our enemy. It's just a part of us that needs gentle redirecting. Stoicism doesn't ask us to destroy the ego, but to see it clearly, to loosen its grip so we can perceive reality without its distortions. Imagine standing in a crowded marketplace where everyone's shouting their opinions. The Stoic approach isn't to shout back or cover your ears, it's to step aside, find a quiet corner, and listen for the one voice that actually has something to say. That's what this journey is about, learning to distinguish the signal from the noise, not just in the world around us, but within ourselves, because the advice that changes lives isn't the kind that demands applause. It's the kind that waits patiently for you to be ready to hear it. We live in a world that mistakes volume for value, where the loudest voice in the room is often mistaken for the wisest. But Stoicism challenges this illusion head-on. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of history's most influential philosophers, put it bluntly: it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Notice how his words carry weight without raising their voice. That's the paradox of real authority. It doesn't need to dominate the conversation to leave its mark. The ego, though, craves the opposite. It confuses shouting with strength, talking over others with leadership. How many times have we ignored the measured advice of a mentor because someone else drowned them out with confidence but little substance? Consider the quiet CEO who steers their company through a crisis not with grand speeches, but with deliberate actions and calm decisions. Their power lies in what they don't say, the space they leave for reflection, the humility to listen. Contrast that with the charismatic figure who commands attention but leaves chaos in their wake. The difference isn't just style, it's a fundamental distinction between ego and wisdom. One needs the spotlight, the other shines without it. Now think about your own life. Can you recall a moment when you brushed aside a subtle suggestion, maybe from a colleague, a friend, or even your own intuition, only to realize later it was exactly what you needed to hear? That's the cost of letting volume dictate importance. The ego loves a spectacle, but growth happens in the quiet corners where we're humble enough to admit we don't have all the answers. Stoicism reminds us the less we need to prove, the more we're free to learn. True authority isn't seized, it's earned through the kind of quiet consistency that outlasts every noisy opinion. The Stoics had a radical approach to conversation, one that feels almost foreign in today's world of instant reactions and endless talking. Seneca, the philosopher who tutored Nero, wrote letters urging his friends to listen, as if every word might contain a hidden truth. Imagine that, treating each sentence from another person not as a pause in your own monologue, but as a potential doorway to insight. This wasn't just politeness, it was a disciplined practice of humility. Because when we truly listen without planning our rebuttal, without filtering the other person's words through our own biases, we disarm the ego's need to be right. And in that space, something remarkable happens. We actually learn. Now contrast that with how most conversations unfold today. How often do we find ourselves half listening while mentally rehearsing our next clever point? The ego thrives in those moments. It turns dialogue into a competition, not because we're cruel, but because we've mistaken speaking for influence and silence for weakness. Stoicism flips this script entirely. Think of Epictetus, who famously said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." That's not just a cute proverb, it's a survival strategy for wisdom in a noisy world. The ego wants to assert, to correct, to claim territory, but the Stoic knows real power lies in the quiet act of receiving before responding. Here's a simple but transformative exercise. The next time you're in a conversation, try inserting a deliberate pause after the other person finishes speaking. Not a hurried silence where you're just waiting for your turn, but a true moment of absorption. 1 breath, 2 breaths. You'll notice something startling: how often your first instinct is to jump in with agreement or disagreement rather than to reflect. That gap between hearing and replying, that's where the ego loses its grip and wisdom has room to grow. So ask yourself this: when was the last time you listened to someone, truly listened without already composing your response in your head? Without mentally scoring points or steering the conversation toward your own perspective. If it's harder to recall than you'd like, you're not alone. But here's the good news. Every conversation is a chance to practice this ancient Stoic art. Because when we stop treating dialogue as a battlefield for our ego and start treating it as fertile ground for understanding, something shifts. The loudest voice in the room isn't necessarily the one that leaves a lasting impact. Often, it's the person who listened well enough to say the one thing that mattered. There's a quiet tragedy in how much energy we waste chasing applause that doesn't matter. The ego thrives on validation, likes, praise, the approving nods of strangers, as if these were the currency of our worth. But Marcus Aurelius, writing alone by candlelight, cut straight to the heart of it. It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. Think about that contradiction. We'll sacrifice hours crafting the perfect social media post, editing our lives into highlight reels designed to impress people we barely know. Why? Because the ego mistakes visibility for value. It's convinced that if enough people applaud, we must be doing something right. Stoicism offers a liberating alternative. What if the only audience that truly mattered was the one person you can never escape yourself? Not the curated version of you, but the one who shows up when the screens are off and the room is quiet. That's where real approval is built. Imagine scrolling through your feed and feeling no urge to post, no itch to compare, because your sense of worth isn't hostage to external reactions. That's not indifference, it's freedom. The Stoics called it ataraxia, a state of unshakable calm that comes from disentangling your self-esteem from things you can't control. Here's the challenge lurking beneath every craving for validation. The more we rely on others to define our value, the less we trust our own compass. Picture someone who constantly checks their phone after sharing an opinion, anxious for confirmation. Now contrast that with someone who speaks their truth and moves on, unaffected by silence or criticism. The difference isn't confidence, it's sovereignty. The first person is outsourcing their judgment. The second has done the harder work of building an inner citadel, as Marcus called it, where external noise can't penetrate. So where does this show up in your life? Maybe it's the way you rehearse conversations hoping for a specific reaction, or the subtle disappointment when an achievement goes unnoticed. Try this for one day. Act as if no one's watching, not in a reckless way, but with the quiet assurance of someone who answers to a higher standard than public opinion. Notice what changes when you stop performing for an audience that was never really paying attention to begin with. The ego will protest, it loves the spotlight, but beneath that discomfort is something far more valuable. The unshakable quiet of knowing your worth doesn't need to be proven, only lived. Silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a deliberate act of strength. The Stoics understood this better than most. Epictetus, the philosopher who taught that we control nothing but our own minds, called silence the universal refuge. Not a retreat from the world, but a way to reclaim our clarity from the chaos. Picture two leaders. One fills every meeting with booming declarations. The other speaks only when their words carry weight. Which commands more respect? The ego thrives on filling space, mistaking constant commentary for competence. But Stoicism reveals the irony. Those who speak least often say the most. History offers a striking example in Cato the Younger, the Roman senator who became a symbol of Stoic integrity. When Julius Caesar, a master of spectacle, marched his armies across Rome, Cato didn't counter with grand speeches. He opposed tyranny through quiet, unyielding principle, voting against unjust laws, walking out of corrupt debates, embodying his values so consistently that his silence became louder than any propaganda. Caesar had the crowds, but Cato had something rarer, the unshakable respect of those who recognized substance over sound. This isn't about never speaking up. It's about recognizing that words gain power when they're scarce. Think of a time you regretted speaking in haste, maybe an argument where volume replaced reasoning, or a moment you rushed to fill a pause with unnecessary noise. Now recall a time you held back, letting silence do the work. Chances are the second scenario left deeper impact. The Stoics called this disciplined restraint, the art of treating speech like a limited resource. Every unnecessary word dilutes the ones that matter. So what happens when we embrace more silence in daily life? First, we disrupt the ego's compulsive need to perform. Instead of rehearsing our next witty remark in conversations, we actually hear what others are saying. Instead of announcing our goals to harvest praise, we let results speak for themselves. Silence becomes the space where patience grows, where we notice details the noisy mind overlooks: a colleague's unspoken frustration, the quiet solution hiding beneath a problem's surface. Try this experiment for one day. Measure your words like currency. Ask yourself before speaking, is this necessary? Is it kind? Does it serve a purpose beyond feeding my ego? You'll discover something surprising. The less you say, the more people lean in when you do, because silence wielded with intention isn't empty. It's the fertile ground where real wisdom takes root. Humility, in the Stoic sense, isn't about diminishing yourself. It's about seeing yourself clearly without the ego's distortions. Seneca, who navigated the treacherous courts of Nero, called it the quiet recognition that wisdom belongs to no one person. Think about that for a moment. Humility isn't self-deprecation. It's the honest admission that we're all works in progress and that every interaction is an opportunity to learn rather than prove. The ego resists this fiercely. It wants to be the hero of every story, the expert in every room. But humility disarms that need by asking a simple question: what if growth matters more than being right? Consider the modern CEO who credits their team openly, who listens more than they speak, who treats every failure as a lesson rather than a threat to their image. Their influence doesn't come from dominance, it comes from the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need to dominate. A study of leadership at one of the world's most innovative companies found that the most respected managers weren't the ones with the loudest voices, but those who asked the most questions. That's humility in action, creating space for others to shine, because your worth isn't tied to being the smartest person in the room. Now think about your own life. Recall a recent disagreement where you dug in your heels, where the urge to win overshadowed the chance to understand. Maybe it was a political debate, a workplace conflict, or even a trivial argument about whose memory of an event was correct. What would have shifted if you'd approached it with stoic humility, not surrendering your viewpoint, but holding it lightly enough to consider another's? The ego hates this. It equates compromise with weakness, but humility knows better. It's the strength to say, I might be missing something, without fearing it undermines your worth. Seneca wrote letters advising his friends to speak as if someone wiser were listening. That's the essence of humility, acting as if every moment is a chance to grow, not just perform. The irony: the less you need to prove, the more others trust your judgment, because humility isn't about making yourself small. It's about making your understanding vast enough to hold both confidence and curiosity, without letting either drown out the other. The next time you feel the ego's itch to assert, try this: pause and ask what you might gain by listening instead. The answer might surprise you. There's a peculiar trap that catches even the most well-intentioned among us: the urge to turn every conversation into a stage for intellectual performance. We've all seen it, someone dissecting an idea not to understand it, but to showcase their own brilliance. The ancient Stoic teacher Musonius Rufus saw right through this charade. He warned his students that words are only useful if they lead to action, otherwise they're just noise. Think about that. How many debates have you witnessed or participated in where the goal wasn't truth or connection, but to outmaneuver the other person? The ego loves these moments. It disguises competitiveness as curiosity, turning dialogue into a subtle battle for dominance. Picture this scenario: two colleagues arguing over a minor detail in a project meeting. One keeps interjecting with, "Actually, if you look at the data," or "technically, the correct term is." They cite obscure facts, correct pronunciation, dominate the conversation, and by the end, they've won. But at what cost? The room's energy deflates, respect erodes, because intellectual showmanship doesn't persuade, it alienates. The Stoics recognized this centuries ago. True wisdom, they argued, isn't measured by how many points you score in a debate, but by whether your words leave others wiser or kinder than before. Here's the uncomfortable question: have you ever prioritized being right over being kind? Maybe you interrupted someone mid-sentence to correct a trivial error. Or doubled down on an argument long after it stopped serving any purpose beyond protecting your pride. The ego whispers, they need to know you're smart, but wisdom asks, what's the cost of proving it? Musonius Rufus taught that the mark of an educated mind isn't eloquence, it's the ability to improve oneself and others. That's the difference between speaking to impress and speaking to uplift. Consider the quiet power of someone who could demolish an opponent with logic but chooses not to. Think of Socrates, who famously said, "I know that I know nothing." That wasn't false modesty, it was a disciplined refusal to let knowledge become a weapon. The ego wants to be seen as the smartest in the room. Stoicism trains us to ask a better question. What if the real goal isn't to shine, but to illuminate? After all, the brightest light isn't the one that blinds, it's the one that helps others see. Marcus Aurelius left us a radical idea in his private writings. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. What he's describing isn't indifference, but a profound kind of freedom, the ability to hold others' opinions lightly without letting them dictate your worth. Think about the last time someone criticized you. Maybe it was a passing comment about your work or a relative's unsolicited advice on your life choices. Recall that visceral reaction, the heat in your chest, the mental scramble to defend yourself. That's the ego in action, treating every opinion as a verdict on your value. But here's what Stoicism reveals. Another person's judgment says far more about them than it does about you. The ego clings to praise and recoils from criticism like a plant bending toward sunlight. But Marcus offers a different metaphor. Imagine standing by a river, watching leaves float past. Some are beautiful, others torn or rotting. You wouldn't jump in to chase the pretty ones or fight the ugly ones. You'd let them all drift by. That's how Stoics train us to treat opinions, not as truths to internalize or threats to repel, but as passing phenomena worth observing but not owning. The moment we stop asking, do they approve of me, and start asking, does this feedback help me grow, we reclaim our sovereignty. Here's how to practice this detachment in daily life. First, notice the physical signs, the clenched jaw, the quickened pulse when criticism lands. That's your signal to pause, not react. Next, ask yourself, is this person's view within my control? If not, and it almost never is, mentally place it on that river alongside all the other leaves. Then, the crucial step, extract the useful kernel if any exists. Maybe the comment about your presentation being too detailed reflects a colleague's preference, but could also hint at a chance to sharpen your focus. The ego screams, they're wrong. Wisdom whispers, what can I learn here? Try this experiment for a week. Keep a small notebook tally each time you feel defensive, whether it's a critique from your boss or a stranger's dismissive glance. Don't judge yourself, just observe. You'll likely uncover a startling pattern. How much energy you waste seeking validation or resisting disapproval. Now imagine redirecting that energy toward what truly matters. Your actions, your growth, your peace. That's the Stoic secret. Others' opinions don't define you unless you hand them the pen to write your story. The less you need their approval, the more you'll find your own. Seneca once observed that, while words point the way, actions carry you there. A truth anyone who's ever been profoundly influenced by another person can attest to. Think back to a teacher, a coach, or a colleague who never gave grand speeches, yet whose quiet consistency reshaped your perspective. Maybe it was the way they handled setbacks without complaint, or how they treated the janitor with the same respect as the CEO. These unspoken lessons lodge themselves in our memory with far more tenacity than any lecture. The Stoics understood this deeply. Real teaching often happens in the spaces between words, in what isn't said but demonstrated day after day. Consider the story of a young apprentice shadowing a master craftsman. The master rarely stopped work to explain instead. The apprentice learned by watching the careful way tools were cleaned, the patience with which imperfections were sanded away, the refusal to rush even when deadlines loomed. Years later, that apprentice might struggle to recall a single piece of advice the master verbalized, yet could replicate every motion of their craft flawlessly. That's the alchemy of leading by example. It bypasses the ego's resistance to being told what to do and instead invites imitation through admiration. Now reflect on your own life. Who modeled strength for you without announcing it? Perhaps a parent who worked double shifts without self-pity, teaching you resilience more powerfully than any motivational quote. Or a friend who listened without interrupting during your darkest hour, showing you the weight silence can carry. These are the living embodiments of Stoic wisdom, people who understood, as Seneca did, that character isn't built through pronouncements but through the 1,000 small choices no one applauds. Here's the challenge this raises. We often overestimate the impact of our words and underestimate the ripple effects of our actions. The Stoics practiced what they called the discipline of assent, aligning their behaviors so completely with their values that their very presence became instructive. Imagine if we all approached life this way, not as performers delivering lines, but as living lessons in progress. The quiet mentor who changed you didn't set out to be profound. They were simply being themselves with unshakable integrity. And that's the hidden gift of unspoken advice. It doesn't feel like teaching at all, until one day you catch yourself acting differently because their example took root in you. The ego has a peculiar terror, not of failure, but of being unseen. It whispers, if no one notices your work, does it even matter? This fear drives so much unnecessary effort. The late nights perfecting projects no one requested, the subtle name dropping in conversations, the compulsive checking of metrics to see who's paying attention. Epictetus, who knew what it meant to be overlooked, born a slave, dismissed by many, cut through this anxiety with one razor-sharp question. Why should we anxiously expect what happens anyway? His point wasn't cynical, it was liberating. The sun doesn't demand praise for rising. A tree doesn't wither if no one admires its shade. Yet we, convinced our contributions require an audience, tie our worth to visibility. Consider a modern workplace scenario. You've spent weeks refining a proposal that gets attributed to someone else in a meeting. The heat in your chest isn't about the idea being stolen, it's the terror of becoming invisible. The ego screams, correct them, claim credit, but Stoicism asks a quieter question. Did the work serve its purpose? If the proposal helps the team, does it truly matter whose name is attached? This isn't about tolerating injustice, it's about recognizing how much suffering comes from conflating value with validation. What Epictetus called, what's within our control, includes our effort, our integrity, our willingness to contribute, not the reactions or recognition that follow. A chef can't force diners to appreciate their dish, only to prepare it with care. The same applies to every creative act, every quiet act of service. When we untangle our work from the need for applause, something unexpected happens. We're freed to focus on mastery rather than performance. Imagine two artists. One paints for gallery openings and Instagram likes, altering their style to match trends. The other paints because the act itself feels like breathing, whether the canvases ever leave the studio. The first is always chasing the next hit of external approval. The second has discovered what the Stoics called eudaimonia, flourishing that comes from within. So here's the challenge. Next time you complete something meaningful but unnoticed, a solved problem no one saw you fix, a kindness no one witnessed, pause before seeking credit. Sit with the discomfort, then ask yourself, if I were the last person on earth, would this still have been worth doing? The answer might surprise you. Because the moments we work without an audience are often the ones that reveal what truly drives us, love of the craft or hunger for the spotlight, and only one of those sustains you when the applause fades. Patience is the quiet counterweight to the ego's constant need for immediacy. Marcus Aurelius, in his private writings, often reflected on time's vastness, how even the most urgent crises shrink to insignificance when viewed against the backdrop of centuries. Think of the infinite past and future, he wrote, and see how your tiny moment is barely a whisper. That perspective wasn't meant to diminish our struggles, but to free us from the ego's frantic grip. When we're cut off in traffic or left waiting for a reply, the ego reacts like a child denied candy, indignant, impulsive, convinced the universe owes it satisfaction now. But Stoicism offers a different path, the deliberate pause, the breath between stimulus and response where wisdom grows. Consider how differently two people handle the same frustration, a delayed flight, for instance. One paces, complains, demands answers from exhausted staff. The other sits with a book, adjusting their expectations to reality rather than railing against it. The difference isn't temperament, it's training. The Stoics saw patience not as passive resignation, but as active resilience. Every moment of withheld reaction is a small victory over the ego's tyranny. Epictetus, born into slavery, had every reason to lash out at life's unfairness. Yet he taught that no one is free who isn't master of themselves. That mastery begins with the simplest act, choosing not to react on autopilot. Here's where patience transforms from virtue to practice. Try this exercise for one day. Impose a 5-second rule on minor annoyances. A coworker interrupts you. Count silently before responding. Coffee spills, pause before cursing. Those seconds create space for something rare, the chance to decide rather than default. You'll notice something revealing. The ego hates this delay. It wants to assign blame immediately, to assert control through outrage. But beneath that discomfort lies an insight. Most of what feels urgent isn't. The Stoics called this the discipline of assent, the practice of withholding judgment until reason, not emotion, takes the lead. Now look deeper. Where in your life could patience replace frustration? Maybe it's the simmering resentment when a partner forgets a chore, or the internal monologue that insists goals should materialize faster. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "You've been given exactly the time you need." Not more, not less. The ego fixates on timelines, promotions due by 30, relationships that follow scripts, milestones measured against others. But patience asks a radical question. What if everything is unfolding exactly as it should, even when it contradicts your plans? History offers a striking example in Abraham Lincoln, who filled his early years with failures, lost elections, bankruptcies, personal tragedies. Yet his private letters reveal not bitterness, but a steadfast trust in gradual progress. That's the Stoic patience in action, the understanding that growth happens in seasons, not sprints. The ego wants visible trophies. Wisdom values invisible roots. So the next time impatience flares when the elevator takes too long or success feels delayed, remember, you're not being tested. You're being shown where the ego still holds the reins and where patience could set you free. History remembers Cato the Younger not for thunderous speeches or grand gestures, but for the weight of his silence. In an era when Roman politicians competed to outshout each other in the Senate, Cato stood apart, voting against corruption not with dramatic flair, but with quiet, unbroken resolve. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, sparking civil war, Cato didn't rally supporters with fiery rhetoric. He simply left Rome, refusing to legitimize tyranny with his presence. His power came not from volume, but from the unshakable consistency of his character. Plutarch wrote that even Caesar feared Cato's influence, precisely because it couldn't be countered with logic or force. It was rooted in something far more formidable, moral authority that needed no microphone. Contrast this with modern leadership theatrics, the executives who mistake bombastic tweets for vision, the influencers who equate controversy with wisdom. The ego confuses decibels with credibility, but history paints a different picture. Look at figures like Nelson Mandela, who emerged from 27 years of imprisonment without bitterness, leading South Africa through reconciliation rather than revenge. His quiet dignity disarmed opponents more effectively than any ultimatum. Or consider Jacinda Ardern's response to the Christchurch massacre. No chest-thumping rhetoric, just empathy and policy. These leaders understood what the Stoics taught. When you remove the ego's need to perform, what remains is pure, persuasive power. Now think about today's landscape. Who embodies this quiet strength in your world? Maybe it's a teacher who transforms lives without seeking headlines, or a colleague whose calm presence stabilizes every crisis. The test isn't fame, it's whether their influence outlasts their words, because true leadership, as Cotto proved, isn't about dominating the conversation. It's about setting a standard so clear that others voluntarily rise to meet it. The loudest voices shape today's headlines, but the quietest often shape centuries. Here's the revealing paradox. Cotto's contemporaries mocked his stubborn principles until they needed them. When chaos engulfed Rome, it was his unyielding example they invoked. The same pattern repeats today. We chase charismatic figures who promise easy answers, then wonder why their solutions crumble under scrutiny. Meanwhile, those practicing Stoic leadership, focusing on duty over applause, substance over spectacle, build foundations that endure. Their secret, recognizing that integrity doesn't need a spotlight to cast a long shadow. So consider this challenge. Next time you're tempted to prove your worth through words, ask instead what actions would speak for you if you never spoke again. That's the Stoic litmus test for real influence, because the world has enough performers. What it needs are more people who lead not with their voices, but with their choices. Success to the ego is a flashing neon sign, something to be seen, envied, and applauded. It thrives on the dopamine hit of social media notifications, the job titles that impress strangers at parties, the trappings of recognition that scream, "Look how far I've come." But Seneca, watching Rome's elite chase hollow victories 2,000 years ago, saw through this charade. How much better to heal your own wounds than to display them for admiration, he wrote. That's the Stoic challenge to our modern obsession with visibility. What if the metrics we're chasing, likes, promotions, net worth, are distractions from the only success that doesn't evaporate when the crowd moves on? Take the tech founder who sells their startup for millions but secretly dreads empty mornings without the grind. Or the influencer with millions of followers who edits their face into unrecognizability before posting, terrified of losing the algorithm's favor. These aren't outliers, they're symptoms of a culture that conflates attention with achievement. The Stoics measured success differently, not by how widely you're celebrated, but by how deeply you live in alignment with your principles. Marcus Aurelius could have commissioned statues across the empire. Instead, he wrote reminders to himself like this: waste no more time arguing what a good person should be. Be one. Here's the uncomfortable truth the ego avoids. Public acclaim is a fickle currency. History's most revered figures, from Epictetus to Einstein, weren't pursuing fame. They were solving problems, serving others, or seeking truths. Even today, think of the nurse who holds a dying patient's hand without cameras rolling, or the teacher who sparks a lifelong love of learning in a single student. Their impact may never trend on social media, but it echoes in ways no viral moment can match. So how do we untangle real success from the ego's performance? Start by asking two questions. First, if no one ever knew I did this, would it still feel meaningful? That separates intrinsic motivation from the hunger for validation. Second, when I'm old, will this be a story I tell with pride or regret? The answers reveal whether you're building a life or just a resume. The Stoics called this living according to nature, not chasing external markers, but tending to your character like a gardener cultivates soil. A tree doesn't measure its worth by how many birds nest in its branches, but by how deeply its roots hold during storms. That's the quiet shift in perspective that changes everything. Success isn't what shines. It's what sustains. There's a peculiar freedom in being forgotten by history, a freedom the Stoics understood intimately. Musonius Rufus, the teacher who shaped Epictetus, lived this principle so thoroughly that we don't even know his full name. Unlike the philosophers who clamored for students or political influence, he taught in simple clothes, insisting that true wisdom needed no adornment. When exiled to a barren island, he didn't pen desperate letters to regain his status. He planted gardens and continued teaching whoever would listen. His legacy wasn't built on fame, but on the quiet ripple of lives he changed without demanding they remember his name. Now contrast that with today's obsession with personal branding, the pressure to curate every aspect of our lives for public consumption. We document meals for Instagram, craft LinkedIn posts like press releases, and measure our worth in follower counts. The ego thrives in this economy, whispering that invisibility equals irrelevance. But history tells a different story. Consider the anonymous donor who paid off lunch debts for an entire school district, leaving no name, just a note saying, "Be kind when you can." Their action didn't need a byline to nourish hundreds of families, or the nurse who stayed hours past her shift holding the hand of a dying COVID patient when no family could visit. These aren't footnotes, they're proof that impact doesn't require an audience. The Stoics practiced something radical. They measured their days not by visibility, but by virtue. Musonius taught that if you're truly living rightly, you'll need no witnesses to confirm it. Imagine applying that to your own life. What project would you still pursue if no one praised it? What kindness would you extend if it couldn't be posted or praised? The answers reveal where your motivations lie, in the work itself or the reflection it casts. Here's the paradox: when we stop performing for applause, our actions gain a different kind of weight. Think of a tree growing in an empty forest. Its rings still thicken, its roots still dig deeper, whether anyone admires its shade or not. That's the Stoic secret to enduring influence, not chasing legacy, but tending to the quiet integrity of each choice. The ego screams for monuments, wisdom plants seeds that outlive memory. So try this experiment. For 1 week, do something meaningful, something that aligns with your deepest values, and tell no one. Not a humble brag, not a coded tweet. Let the act exist solely between you and your principles. You'll likely feel the ego's resistance, its itch to be seen. But beneath that discomfort lies a revelation. The purest form of freedom is doing what matters simply because it matters. Musonius knew this. 2,000 years later, his nameless example still teaches us, not through scrolls or statues, but through the enduring power of living unseen. True confidence, in the Stoic sense, has nothing to do with the volume of your voice or the boldness of your claims. Epictetus, the philosopher who transformed his enslavement into a masterclass on inner freedom, put it bluntly: don't explain your philosophy, embody it. That's the essence of Stoic confidence. It doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Think of a mountain. It doesn't convince you of its solidity by shouting. It simply stands, unaffected by the winds that howl around it. The ego craves validation, mistaking loudness for strength. But real strength, it's the quiet certainty of someone who knows their worth isn't up for debate. Consider two leaders facing a crisis. One pounds the table, declaring, "Trust me, I've got this." The other listens, nods, and says, "Here's what we'll do." The difference isn't competence, it's source code. The first is running on ego, the second on principle. Stoicism teaches that confidence rooted in external validation is brittle. It crumbles the moment the applause stops, but confidence grounded in self-knowledge, that's unshakable. Epictetus, who taught in a cramped classroom rather than a grand lecture hall, reminded his students, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish." Not because ignorance is virtue, but because the opinion of others doesn't define your truth. Here's a practice to cultivate this quiet assurance. Each morning, name one thing you believe deeply, not a boast to post online, but a private conviction you'll live by that day. Maybe it's, "I treat setbacks as lessons," or "My worth isn't determined by productivity." The key, keep it between you and your reflection. This isn't about crafting mantras. It's about aligning your actions with your values so consistently that no external confirmation is required. The ego will itch to share, to perform, resist. Confidence that needs an audience isn't confidence, it's theater. Recall a time you confused volume for validity. Maybe it was interrupting a meeting to prove your point, or laughing too loudly at a joke you didn't find funny. Beneath those moments lies a quiet panic, the fear that if you don't perform, you'll disappear. Stoicism offers a liberating alternative. What if you stopped performing and started being? Not every thought needs a megaphone. Not every action requires witnesses. Real confidence isn't measured in decibels. It's the silent understanding that you're enough, even when the room is empty. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal a simple but devastating reminder. Ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? He wasn't talking about grand life choices. He meant the words we let slip in casual conversation, the explanations we offer when no one asked, the compulsive need to fill silence with sound. There's a Stoic discipline hidden in that question, one the ego resists with every fiber, the art of letting your actions speak so clearly that words become redundant. Think about the last time you felt misunderstood. Maybe a coworker misread your intentions, or a family member jumped to conclusions about your choices. Recall the heat that rose in your chest, the urgency to correct, to clarify, to make them see your side. That's the ego's fingerprint, not just the desire to be understood, but the terror of being misjudged. Now picture this scenario. A manager notices her team making a decision she disagrees with. The ego's script demands she intervene immediately, lay out her reasoning, assert her authority, ensure they recognize her expertise. But what if she waits? What if she lets the plan unfold, observing quietly as the team discovers the flaw for themselves? The lesson sticks deeper when it's earned rather than dictated. That's the power of strategic silence. It creates space for others to arrive at wisdom without your fingerprints on it. Seneca called this the eloquence of omission, the ability to teach more by saying less. The ego mistakes explanation for influence. It believes that if it can just phrase things perfectly, others will finally get it. But Stoicism reveals the irony. The more we explain, the less we're heard. Imagine pouring water into an already full glass. It doesn't matter how pure the water is. It will only spill over. People absorb truths when they're ready, not when we're eager to deliver them. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire with this principle, writing, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." He didn't mean revenge in the petty sense. He meant refusing to mirror the noise around you. When others exaggerate, stay measured. When they interrupt, listen. Let your restraint become the counterargument that lingers long after the conversation ends. So here's the challenge. Scan your recent interactions for a moment where silence would have been sharper than speech. Maybe it was defending a choice no one questioned, or over-explaining a joke that would have landed better unexplained. The ego insists, but they'll think X if I don't say Y. Wisdom asks, what if their assumptions aren't your responsibility? This isn't about suppressing your voice, it's about freeing it from the compulsion to justify. When you stop treating every silence as a vacuum you must fill, you'll discover something unexpected. The quiet carries your meaning further than your words ever could. The ego treats silence like a threat because in those quiet moments, its illusions start to unravel. Think about how quickly we reach for our phones in an empty elevator or fill awkward pauses with nervous chatter. That discomfort isn't accidental. Stoicism teaches that silence is the mirror where we meet ourselves undistorted, and the ego would rather shatter the glass than face what's reflected. Seneca, who often withdrew from Rome's chaos to write letters on solitude, put it starkly: "You must retreat into yourself as often as you can, for nowhere will you find a more tranquil retreat than in your own soul." Notice he didn't say, "Think about yourself," but "retreat into yourself," as if self-awareness weren't an activity, but a sacred space we've forgotten how to enter. Modern life conspires against this retreat. We curate podcasts for showering, soundtrack our commutes, drown dinner in background TV, as if stillness were a vacuum to be filled. But the Stoics recognized a profound truth. What we avoid in silence isn't emptiness, but the raw material of our lives waiting to be examined. Picture a snow globe shaken constantly by notifications and small talk. Only when the flakes settle do you see the landscape clearly. That's why the ego panics when the noise stops, because silence forces it to confront what it's been muffling. Regrets rationalized as busyness, fears disguised as planning, or the quiet voice whispering that you're living someone else's version of success. Here's a practice to test this. Set a timer for 10 minutes, no music, no screens, no agenda. Just sit, perhaps near a window or in a comfortable chair, and observe what arises. You'll likely notice 3 phases. First, the ego's tantrum, itching to check emails, replaying old arguments, inventing urgent tasks. This is its survival tactic. Distraction is its oxygen. Next, if you persist, a shift. The mind begins to untangle itself like sediment settling in water. Finally, glimpses of clarity, not grand revelations, but simple truth you've been too busy to hear. Maybe it's exhaustion you've ignored, a creative idea buried under noise, or the startling realization that you haven't truly exhaled in days. Seneca warned his friend Lucilius about mistaking motion for progress. You're rushing everywhere, yet going nowhere. That's the paradox silence exposes. We mistake the ego's churn for productivity, when often it's just a disguise for avoidance. The executive who schedules back-to-back meetings to feel important, the student who studies with the TV on to mute self-doubt, both are fleeing the very quiet that could help them grow. So here's the challenge. For 1 week, gift yourself those 10 silent minutes daily, not as meditation with a goal, but as an experiment in presence. Notice what the ego throws at you: boredom, restlessness, even existential dread, and meet it with curiosity rather than resistance. The Stoics called this the view from above, the ability to observe your own mind as dispassionately as clouds passing. What you'll likely discover isn't some flaw requiring fixing, but a neglected inner compass realigning itself, because when the noise fades, what remains isn't nothing. It's the voice you've been waiting to hear. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who endured slavery before becoming one of history's most revered teachers, faced insults daily, not just from strangers but from those who resented his wisdom. His response, a revolutionary approach: when someone speaks harshly to you, consider it like the barking of a dog. The noise says more about them than it does about you. That wasn't indifference, it was a deliberate recalibration of power. The ego hears an insult and reacts like a struck match, immediate, hot, and quick to burn out. But Stoicism offers a different path, one where provocations become opportunities to practice sovereignty over your own mind. Picture this scenario: a coworker snaps at you in a meeting, questioning your competence in front of peers. The ego's script demands retaliation, a cutting remark, a defensive monologue, or at least simmering resentment for days. But Epictetus trained his students to engage in mental time travel instead. First, pause, not just a breath, but a full moment to ask, is this insult within my control? If the answer is no, and it almost always is, the next question becomes, what part of this is actually about me? Often, you'll find the barb was never aimed at you personally, but hurled from someone else's pain, insecurity, or bad day. Here's where Stoicism transforms theory into practice. When insulted, follow this three-step discipline. Step 1. Physical awareness. Notice the sensations, the clenched jaw, the quickened pulse without judging them. This creates space between stimulus and response. Step 2. Mental reframing. Visualize the words as objects passing by, like leaves on a river. You wouldn't jump in to retrieve a rotting leaf. Why clutch a hurtful phrase? Step 3. Compassionate inquiry. Ask silently, what wound might be driving this person's need to lash out? This isn't about excusing cruelty, but about refusing to let it dictate your inner state. Marcus Aurelius perfected this art while ruling Rome. Amidst Senate backstabbing and military betrayals, he wrote in his journal, "The best revenge is to be unlike your enemy." Not passive avoidance, but active transcendence, responding to pettiness with patience, to hostility with unshakable calm. His power came from a startling realization. When you refuse to play the insult game, the insult loses its target. Now consider your own life. How would your most fraught relationships shift if you replaced knee-jerk reactions with this stoic pause? The parent who pushes your buttons, the friend who backhandedly criticizes, what if their words no longer triggered you but revealed where your ego still seeks validation? That's the hidden gift of provocation. It shows us exactly where we're still chained to others' opinions. Every insult resisted with grace is another link broken. The ego fears this approach, whispering, if you don't fight back, they'll think they won. But Stoicism asks a better question. What exactly is there to win? Temporary satisfaction from a clever comeback, the illusion of dominance. Epictetus, who had every reason to resent his captors, chose a different metric: who is unconquerable. The one who cannot be upset by anything outside their reasoned choice. That's the ultimate freedom, not controlling what others say, but mastering how you hear it. Try this experiment. Next time someone's words sting, resist the urge to react immediately. Instead, mentally label the emotion, "This is my pride hurting," or "This is my fear of being disrespected." That simple act of naming disrupts the ego's hijack. You'll discover something transformative. Most insults only hold power when we rush to give them meaning. Leave them unanswered and they crumble like paper tigers, because the truth is, no one can insult you without your cooperation. The Stoics didn't ignore provocation, they outgrew it. And that quiet victory changes everything. Marcus Aurelius never raised a sword to command loyalty. He earned it through the quiet consistency of his character. While other emperors ruled through fear or flamboyance, he led by embodying Stoic principles so completely that others willingly aligned with his vision. Historians note how he'd pause thoughtfully before speaking in Senate debates, leaving space for reason rather than rhetoric. When advisors urged harsher punishments for dissenters, he'd redirect with questions. What if this were your child? His influence wasn't in decrees, but in making people feel heard, then guiding them toward wisdom they believed they'd discovered themselves. That's the paradox of Stoic persuasion. The less you insist, the more others adopt your way of thinking. Consider how this plays out in ordinary interactions. A parent tired of nagging their teen about chores might try a different approach, leaving tools by the broken fence without comment. When the child eventually fixes it, they'll take ownership of the idea, thinking it was their own initiative. teachers use this same principle when they guide students toward answers with strategic silence rather than direct corrections. The moment someone feels coerced, resistance builds, but when they believe they've arrived at a conclusion independently, the lesson sticks. This subtlety separates transactional interactions from transformative ones. A manager who dictates deadlines creates compliance. One who asks, "What timeline would you feel proud committing to?" cultivates accountability. The difference lies in trusting the process, that people gravitate toward truth when given space to encounter it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." He understood that lasting change isn't forced, it's nurtured through repeated exposure to integrity. Now reflect on your own experiences. Recall a disagreement where doubling down only hardened the other person's stance. Then remember a time someone influenced you without argument, perhaps through a well-timed question or by modeling the behavior they hoped to see. That's Stoic influence in action, creating conditions where the right choice becomes obvious, then stepping back so others can claim it as their own. The ego wants credit. Wisdom cares only that the outcome serves the greater good. The next time you're tempted to convince someone, try this experiment. Plant the seed, then retreat. Share a single compelling fact without commentary, or ask what they'd advise a friend in the same situation. You'll often find that the quietest nudges, like water shaping stone, leave the deepest marks over time. The ego thrives on a dangerous illusion that with enough effort and worry, we can control outcomes, people, even the future itself. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who knew true powerlessness as a slave, shattered this myth with his famous dichotomy. Some things are within our control, while others are not. On one side, our judgments, values, and actions. On the other, everything else: reputation, health, circumstances, even the behavior of loved ones. The distinction seems simple, yet the ego wages daily war against it, mistaking anxiety for influence and exhaustion for virtue. Picture two commuters stuck in the same traffic jam. One grips the wheel, mutters at red lights, and replays all the ways this delay will ruin their day, as if their frustration could clear the road. The other sits back, listens to an audiobook, and adjusts their schedule mentally. Both arrive at the same time, but only one spent the journey at war with reality. That's the ego's trap. It would rather rage against what it can't change than focus on what it can. Modern life offers endless versions of this struggle, refreshing inboxes for replies we can't force, pleading with children to eat vegetables they've already refused, or agonizing over whether that won't bend to our plans. Here's where Stoicism offers liberation disguised as surrender. Try this exercise for one day. Identify 3 things you typically try to control but realistically can't. Maybe it's your partner's punctuality, a coworker's tone, or the Wi-Fi speed at a cafe. Each time you catch yourself reacting, sighing, correcting, or mentally rewriting the script, pause and whisper Epictetus's line, "This is not mine to command." Then redirect that energy toward what is yours, your breath, your next action, your attitude. You'll notice something startling: how much mental real estate the ego had colonized with futile campaigns. The deeper revelation: control was never the source of peace we imagined. Think of a gardener who obsesses over rain instead of tending to the soil within their reach. The Stoics propose a radical shift. What if true power lies not in dominating external events, but in mastering your response to them? When a flight gets cancelled, the ego fumes at gate agents. Wisdom books the next available seat. Both face the same delay, but one carries an unnecessary burden of resistance. So ask yourself this: what trivial battles is your ego still fighting? The insistence that dishes be loaded a certain way, the need to win, debates about movie preferences. Beneath these surface skirmishes lies a profound choice to spend your limited life force on what enriches you, or exhaust it on proxy wars that change nothing. The irony is this: the more we release our grip on the uncontrollable, the more energy we free up for what actually shapes our lives, our choices, our character, our capacity to meet whatever comes with clear eyes and steady hands. Epictetus, who owned nothing, not even his own body, left us perhaps the greatest inheritance, the realization that our chains are often of our own making. The ego builds prisons of should and must. Stoicism offers the key, a simple question: is this mine to hold? Sometimes the bravest act isn't taking control, but letting go. Seneca once wrote, "Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness, a truth that becomes most powerful when no one's watching." The Stoics saw generosity not as a transaction for gratitude, but as an exercise in virtue, a way to strengthen our connection to humanity without the ego's need for applause. Think of the last time you held a door for a stranger or let a car merge ahead of you in traffic. That fleeting moment likely left no record, no thank you note, no social media post, just the quiet satisfaction of having made the world slightly softer for someone else. That's Stoic ethics in its purest form: action divorced from expectation, kindness as its own reward. History offers a striking example from the Great Depression, when an anonymous donor known only as Mr. Smith paid off the mortgages of dozens of families facing eviction in Chicago. He left no name, demanded no recognition, just instructed the bank to tell recipients that their debt was cleared by a friend. Years later, elderly survivors still spoke of how that act didn't just save their homes, it restored their faith in people. Seneca would have recognized the wisdom in that anonymity. In his letters, he praised those who gave without memory, arguing that true generosity plants seeds without needing to watch them grow. The moment kindness becomes about the giver's reputation rather than the receiver's need, it loses its transformative power for both parties. Here's the challenge lurking beneath every act of kindness: does it still count if no one knows you did it? The ego squirms at this question. It wants credit, wants to be seen as the hero of the story. But Stoicism reframes the entire premise. What if the real gift isn't just what you give, but what you relinquish? The need for recognition, the hunger for praise, the subtle hierarchy that forms when someone owes you thanks. Anonymous kindness disrupts all that. It's humility in action, a way to practice what Marcus Aurelius called the joy of duty quietly discharged. Try this experiment. Sometime in the next 7 days, perform one act of generosity that leaves no trace back to you. Pay for the coffee of the person behind you in line and leave before they notice. Tape quarters to a laundromat dryer with a note saying, "For whoever needs them." Or simply listen, truly listen, to someone who's been overlooked without steering the conversation toward your own stories. The key is to let the deed exist in that sacred space where only two people know, you and the universe. You'll likely notice something unexpected: how light you feel afterward, unburdened by the weight of expectation. That's the ego's grip loosening, because here's the secret Seneca knew: anonymous kindness isn't just a gift to the recipient. It's a silent rebellion against the part of us that craves validation. Every unnoticed good deed is a vote for a different kind of world, one where compassion isn't currency, but oxygen. And the more we practice giving without strings, the more we untangle ourselves from the exhausting performance of virtue. The irony: those quiet acts often ripple further than any public display. That stranger who received your coffee might carry the warmth of that moment all day, passing it forward in ways you'll never see. The Stoics called this sympatheia, the interconnectedness of all things. When you give without claiming credit, you become part of something larger than your own story. So ask yourself, what kind of generosity feels most meaningful when stripped of recognition? Maybe it's slipping a favorite book into a little free library with no inscription, or shoveling a neighbor's sidewalk before dawn. The form doesn't matter, only the intention does. Because in that space between the doing and the disappearing, you'll find a paradox the Stoics cherished. The less you seek credit for your kindness, the more it becomes who you are, rather than just something you do. And that's how we leave fingerprints on the world without leaving a name. Marcus Aurelius faced barbarian invasions, political betrayals, and a devastating plague, yet his private writings reveal not panic but profound stillness. While Rome burned with crisis, he anchored himself in a simple Stoic practice, distinguishing between what he could control and what he couldn't. The ego screams for immediate reaction, mistaking frenzy for effectiveness. But Stoic composure understands that chaos doesn't require matching its energy. It demands a different kind of strength. Picture a modern emergency room during a mass casualty event. The most effective physicians aren't the ones shouting orders. They're the ones moving deliberately, speaking softly, and making decisions with unsettling calm. Their power comes not from ignoring the storm, but from becoming its eye. This isn't passive resignation, it's tactical clarity. When the stock market crashed in 2008, the CEOs who inspired confidence weren't the ones hosting frantic press conferences. They were the ones like Warren Buffett, who famously wrote, "Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful." That's Stoicism in action, recognizing that the ego's panic only amplifies the crisis, while stillness creates space for solutions. The ancient technique works just as well for personal turbulence. Next time your inbox pings with bad news or a heated argument erupts at home, try this 4-second breathing pattern inherited from Roman soldiers. Inhale deeply for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4, and pause empty for 4. This isn't just physiology, it's philosophy in motion. By regulating your breath, you signal to your nervous system that this isn't a life or death moment, even if your ego insists it is. History's most resilient leaders share this common thread. They don't meet chaos with more chaos. Consider the airline captain whose engine fails mid-flight. Their training prioritizes a ritualized calm, reviewing checklists, speaking in measured tones, deliberately slowing movements. Why? Because panic is contagious, but so is composure. The Stoics called this apatheia, not apathy, but freedom from destructive emotions that cloud judgment. Marcus Aurelius practiced it daily, reminding himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Now imagine your current challenge, a looming deadline, a family conflict, a financial setback. How might stillness serve you here, not as avoidance, but as a strategic pause? When the ego demands, "Do something, anything," wisdom asks, what if the most powerful action is waiting until the right action becomes clear? The chaplain who comforts grieving families after a tragedy, the firefighter who methodically searches smoke-filled rooms, they understand what the Stoics taught. Chaos doesn't reward the loudest response, but the most precise one. Your breath can be an anchor in that storm. Your pause can be your power. And in that space between stimulus and response, you'll find the same clarity that guided an emperor through plagues and wars, not by fighting the chaos, but by refusing to let it dictate his inner world. The ego builds fortresses around its mistakes, mistaking admission of error for surrender. It's a peculiar paradox. The more energy we spend defending our blunders, the more brittle our growth becomes. Epictetus, the Stoic teacher who turned his own enslavement into a masterclass on inner freedom, saw through this charade. It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows, he observed. That's the humility of the wise, not self-flagellation, but the quiet recognition that every misstep holds an invitation to evolve. Consider a surgeon who botches a routine procedure. The ego's script demands deflection, blaming faulty equipment, an unpredictable patient, or an exhausted team. But Stoicism offers a different path, the courageous pause where one says, "I failed here." What does this reveal? I learned this the hard way years ago, rushing through a client presentation I'd arrogantly deemed too simple to rehearse. When my slides malfunctioned and my explanations faltered, the room's polite silence was more crushing than any critique. That humiliation became my teacher. By morning, I'd rebuilt the deck with clearer visuals and annotated backup notes, not just fixing the errors, but uncovering gaps in my preparation ritual I'd been too prideful to notice. The Stoics practiced something radical. They kept error journals, documenting daily mistakes alongside lessons extracted. Marcus Aurelius reviewed his own temper in Senate debates. Seneca tracked his tendency to interrupt. This wasn't self-punishment, it was alchemy, transforming the lead of failure into the gold of wisdom. Your most cringe-worthy misjudgment, whether a mistimed investment or a harsh word to a loved one, isn't evidence of incompetence. It's raw material waiting to be refined. So here's the challenge. Pick one recent stumble your ego wants to bury. Maybe it's the project deadline you underestimated, or the argument where you doubled down on being right rather than seeking resolution. Hold it gently like an archaeologist with a fragile artifact and ask, what does this reveal about my blind spots? Where could a touch more humility have changed the outcome? The answers won't always be comfortable, but they'll always be fertile, because the moment we stop fearing mistakes and start mining them, we unlock a truth the Stoics knew well. The path to wisdom isn't paved with perfection, but with the quiet courage to say, I was wrong, and now I'm stronger for it. Seneca's letters reveal a counterintuitive truth. The Stoics didn't measure success by outcomes, but by the depth of their preparation. While the ego obsesses over trophies and applause, wisdom asks a different question: did you show up fully for the work itself? Picture an Olympic sprinter the night before a race. The ego fixates on the medal ceremony, the headlines, the validation. But the athlete, they're laser-focused on the ritual, the precise warm-up routine, the mental visualization, the careful review of technique. Not because these guarantee victory, but because they're the only variables truly within their control. That's the Stoic shift, transferring your sense of worth from the uncontrollable judges' scores, competitors' performances, even your own body's limits on race day, to the sacred discipline of readiness. This philosophy permeated Seneca's daily life. In one letter, he describes preparing for exile not by pleading with emperors or scheming to stay, but by mentally rehearsing life in poverty, sleeping on hard floors, eating simple meals. When his banishment finally came, he wasn't shattered like his peers because he'd already lived it in his mind. The ego screams, but did it work when facing challenges? Stoicism whispers, did you prepare with integrity? There's a liberating power in that distinction. A musician can't control a fickle audience's reaction, but they can master every scale. A writer can't force a bestseller list, but they can honor the blank page each morning. Preparation becomes the compass. Outcomes are just weather patterns. Modern psychology confirms this ancient insight. Studies of elite performers, from surgeons to chess grandmasters, show their brilliance stems not from innate talent, but from what researchers call deliberate practice. They log countless hours refining fundamentals, analyzing mistakes, and simulating high-pressure scenarios. Like Stoics, they know mastery lives in the mundane. The ego wants to skip to the victory lap. Wisdom savors the blisters earned in training. Here's the challenge. pick one area where you've been overly attached to results, maybe a work project, a fitness goal, or a creative pursuit. For 1 week, shift your metric entirely. Instead of tracking pounds lost, focus on showing up for each workout with full presence. Rather than fixating on sales numbers, pour energy into perfecting your pitch's clarity. You'll notice something profound. When preparation becomes the prize, failure loses its sting and success becomes a byproduct. Because the truth is, you may not always get what you want, but you'll always have what you gave. And that's where Stoicism reveals its quiet superpower. The prepared mind turns every outcome, even disappointment, into raw material for growth. The ego clings to fantasies of guaranteed results, but life offers no such contract. What it does offer is this: the chance to meet each moment thoroughly ready, not as a guarantee, but as a gift to yourself and to the work that deserves nothing less than your whole attention. That's the athlete's secret, the artist's vow, the Stoic's compass. The rest is noise. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The fruit of this life is good character and acts for the common good." Notice what's missing. There's no mention of applause, no demand for recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of doing what's right, even if no one ever knows. That's the essence of Stoic joy, finding fulfillment not in the spotlight, but in the unseen work itself. Picture an artist in their studio at dawn, mixing colors with no exhibition deadline looming. The brushstrokes aren't for an audience, they're for the sheer love of bringing something new into the world. That's where effort transcends obligation and becomes its own reward. History's most enduring works often emerged from this private devotion. Beethoven composed his late quartets while completely deaf, knowing he'd never hear the melodies himself. Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 2,000 poems, most discovered only after her death. These weren't acts of resignation. They were celebrations of creative integrity, the kind Marcus Aurelius praised when he said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good artist should be." B1. The Stoics recognized a profound truth. When we divorce effort from expectation, we reclaim the purest form of freedom. Now consider your own life. What do you do simply because it resonates with your core, not because it earns validation? Maybe it's the way you organize your bookshelf when no one's visiting, or the care you put into a handwritten note knowing it won't be posted online. These small, unseen acts are more than habits, they're declarations of independence from the ego's hunger for approval. The athlete who trains extra hours when the gym is empty, the teacher who crafts lesson plans long after the classroom lights are off, they understand what the Stoics called the inner citadel, a space where effort and meaning coexist beyond external judgment. The irony, these private disciplines often yield the richest public impact. A chef who tastes every sauce with equal attention, whether serving a critic or a child, builds mastery that can't be faked. A scientist who pursues curiosity-driven research without guaranteed acclaim lays groundwork for breakthroughs no amount of forced effort could replicate. The unseen work isn't just preparation for greatness, it's where greatness quietly lives. So here's the invitation: carve out one daily act that exists purely between you and your principles. Not a performance, not a productivity hacker, just a gesture that reminds you why effort matters in its own right. The Stoics didn't journal for publication, they wrote to clarify their souls. They didn't practice virtue to trend on social media, they did it because alignment with wisdom was its own compass. And in that space, where the work is enough simply because it's yours, you'll discover a joy no audience could ever amplify. Stoicism, at its core, is the art of listening to the quiet voice within rather than the noise around us. Over centuries, its teachings return to the same profound truth: the loudest moments rarely teach us what matters most. It's in the pauses, the unspoken acts, the humility of admitting we don't have all the answers where real wisdom takes root. Think of the last time you felt truly grounded. Chances are it wasn't during a heated argument or a boastful success, but in a moment of stillness when you chose patience over reaction or action over performance. That's the essence of what we've explored: silence over noise, humility over ego, doing over declaring. Epictetus, who knew the weight of chains both physical and mental, put it perfectly: no man is free who is not master of himself. That mastery begins when we stop conflating volume with value. Consider the oak tree. It doesn't announce its growth with fanfare. It simply stands, deepening its roots season after season, unaffected by the storms that rage around it. Stoicism invites us to cultivate that same quiet strength, to measure our days not by how much we're noticed, but by how deeply we live. Here's your challenge for the week ahead. Pick one small way to practice this, not as a grand gesture, but as a silent rebellion against the ego's need for applause. Maybe it's resisting the urge to correct someone when it doesn't truly matter, or completing a task with care even when no one's watching. Notice what arises in those moments: the discomfort, the liberation, the unexpected clarity. Because transformation doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the spaces between, where we're free to grow without an audience. As you go forward, remember this: the most powerful parts of you don't need to shout to be heard. They're already there, steady, resilient, waiting for the noise to fade so they can speak. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. Together, we'll keep exploring how ancient wisdom can light our modern path, one quiet step at a time.